to help us try to understand some of the answers. The former director of Central Intelligence, now the chairman for the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, Ambassador R. James Woolsey. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to America's Forum.
Good to be with you, Judy.
Jim, what do you make of the president's ISIS strategy?
Well, I think I've been fairly critical of him for some time now, but at least he's beginning to be headed in the right direction. I think we sort of thank God for small favors here. He certainly did not issue a battle cry of freedom, and I think that the idea that we're going to be able to do this solely from the air is just not so. We may not need large military units fighting in a traditional fashion, but special forces, SEALs, Army Rangers, CIA officers helping put together ways to advise and oversee our allies, Arab and otherwise. I think those are all going to be necessary. Air power will certainly be an important part of it. Assuming it's used right. Remember in Kosovo, Bill Clinton used only air power when we didn't lose any pilots against the Serbs. Milosevic died in prison, and there's a street named after Bill Clinton in Kosovo, in the capital. So sometimes you can do a lot with air power, but I think here we're going to need to go beyond air power. Hopefully we won't have to go all the way to main force units.
So, Jim, as you described it, a much more ambitious plan for, quote, service members, as the president might call them. Talking about using special forces, it almost sounds like a back to the future strategy, what we saw in the early days post 9/11, when we sent small groups into Afghanistan. Is that fair?
Yes, to some extent. The small number, 100, 200 CIA and Special Forces folks in Afghanistan shortly after 9/11 did a phenomenal job, and a very effective one. We probably will not be able to get by with as limited a set of numbers as that, but I think that we're going to have to, since we haven't been on the ground in Syria, we're going to have to take some rather urgent steps to be able to run targeting and intelligence support for allied units and the rest. We're not going to be able to do this sort of sitting in Washington and talking on phones or something.
Ambassador, the big news today is a revision in the calculation on the number of people involved with ISIS. Now we're hearing perhaps 3 times as many people, over 30,000, than what we earlier thought. You've been director of Central Intelligence. How are we coming up with numbers to begin with, and why this, quote, readjustment?
Well, numbers on something like terrorist groups are really hard to stay on top of, and they can change relatively rapidly. The main thing is the trend, and if the trend is negative from our point of view, whatever the exact numbers, we have to change what we're doing and get on top of the situation so that people on the other side get discouraged. When you're at war, and we have to admit that we are here, the objective is to demoralize the enemy along the line, along the way, to killing him as much as one, or them as much as one needs to. But we want them morose and despondent and not adding more and more recruits, but rather having people drift away from them. And it's the trend that matters, and so far the trend doesn't look great.
Jim, there was something in your answer we need to revisit. You said this is a war. We need, and I'm paraphrasing now, admit as much. And yet yesterday, Secretary of State John Kerry took great pains to say, oh, no, this is not a war. This is a counter-terrorism effort. Was that the wrong move by the Secretary of State in offering his answers in the interviews he gave yesterday?
Well, I rather imagine he was ordered to do that, because they change their actions and their nuances in order to make the narrative fit. Narrative is a terrible word in these circumstances because it really means the story they want to put out as distinct from what's actually happening. And I think that it's a shame that able government officials like Kerry and others have to dance around these commentaries the way they do. Kerry and his colleagues and Secretary of Defense and the others took a firm stand, Secretary of State Clinton took a firm stand against the president in trying to get him to come to the aid of the Syrian rebels against Assad when Assad used chemical weapons, and we had drawn a so-called red line in the sand saying you will not cross that. And the Syrians crossed it, used chemical weapons, and President Obama sort of shrugged and turned things over kind of sort of to the Russians. Or maybe he was going to have a congressional vote. It was a little hard to tell. That kind of behavior by the president makes it very hard for people like Kerry to do their jobs, put together coalitions in Kerry's case, mobilize the military effectively in the case of the Secretary of Defense. And it's really the narrative is a big part of the problem. We should stop using narratives and just say what happened.
Well, as we take a look to what may happen, the president says he wants to arm so-called moderate Syrian rebels. But Ambassador, the question becomes this: how do you differentiate between and among the different groups in Syria, and what elements there can really be trusted?
Well, it's tough, and trust is not a very common commodity sometimes in this part of the world. But those who are fighting and have shown that they will fight against Assad and are not part of the ISA or the fanatics are people we're going to have to work with. Look, we worked closely for 3 years and 8 months from 1941 to 1945 with one of history's worst killers, Joseph Stalin, because we needed him against Hitler. And that's what got us to win among the 2 or 3 main things that helped us win World War II. Sometimes you have to work with folks who are very, very far from perfect. And these are tactical calls, and you do the best you can under the circumstances.
And Jim, mindful of that, and also some other history involving our involvement in our previous associations, is there a chance the groups we arm today to deal with this might become a threat to the U.S. a bit later down the line?
Some could. But that doesn't remove the necessity to make decisions and make calls and do the best you can. Look, going back to my Russian example, when the Soviets rolled into Eastern Europe at the end of World War II, they rolled in on wheels made in Detroit. We supplied them with almost everything they needed during World War II. And it was a terrible shame that we had to, and we ended up losing Eastern Europe for 40 to 50 years as a result of it. Those poor people had to grow up under the thumb of Marxism, Leninism, and Stalin's dictatorship. But we had to do it to win World War II. And eventually we have, if you check today, Czech Republic and Poland and so forth, we did a pretty good job. We came out the other side of World War II with a Cold War that we eventually more or less won. Now, Putin is kind of calling that into question these days by acting a bit like he would have in 1945.
And Jim, of course, none of this occurs. None of this occurs in a vacuum. I think that point is well taken. We have about a minute left. I want to get to another story. Of the coalition, the UK seems to be a bit reticent right now in saying what it will do. Of course, ISIS says that next week, according to its timetable, they're going to execute a British journalist, going to behead a British journalist. Is that the reason for the silence from the UK after what we heard from the Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago?
Well, that may be part of it, but part of it is certainly that the British aren't sure they're going to exist as a country in a week or so. They're going through a very major decision about whether Scotland is to split off and become an independent nation. I would not be a bit surprised for the British to be a bit hesitant now for a while they sort out who they are.
Fair enough. Sadly, we cannot declare our independence from the clock. We are all beholden to the element of time. Our time is just about out. Jim Woolsey, we thank you very much for your insights. America's Forum's coming right back.